already opened the games launcher here. That is the application that starts all of the products that you need for the games creation. So here you see that you can launch Stingray, Scaleform Studio for your user interface, 3D user interface, animated user interface, and then of course Maya LT or Maya 3ds Max Mudbox if you like, and also FBX Review, things like that. In this games launcher, you will also find a number of assets already there. So this is a direct link into Creative Market. Creative Market in the past was actually a platform to sell things like I don't know, paper layouts for letters, for example, and all that 2D stuff. And now Creative Market also has a whole 3D section where you can buy levels, models, characters, and stuff like that. So you can load that from here. There's also a learning section where you can load tutorials for Stingray. The whole Stingray documentation and stuff like that is also in here. So it's worth to look around a little bit in this games launcher. The big green button here, that is the one that launches Stingray. So let's jump into it. Stingray won't open unless you give it a project. So before you can do anything, you have to tell which project you want to load. So there has to be at least a directory there where Stingray can store the stuff. So this first example here, we're going to load something, and because I want to start showing you the user interface of Stingray. So it takes a moment for it to load the scene. So we have a huge 3D window here on the upper left side. Moving the camera is very much like in Maya, so it's easy for me. I'm just holding the Alt key and moving the camera with the middle mouse button. I can move around with the right mouse button. I can zoom in and out. And there's another function for the camera with the right mouse button. You can look around. So that is, you stand on your standpoint and you look around yourself. That's more like a game player perspective where you can look around. You can also hit the W key to move forward, the S key to move backward. So this functionality is on the mouse also, which you normally don't have in Maya. So far for the moment for the perspective view. On the left side, very much like in many Windows programs, you see a bunch of tools. So here's a move and a rotate and a scale function, for example. This play button is actually there to test the level. So it launches a player where you can play your level. Here on the right side, you see a bunch of settings that is completely customizable. So at the moment we have an Explorer here and the Create panel. So in the Create panel you see a number of objects that you can create, like a marker in the world or audio sources or reflection probes and things. So this is another thing. And you can dock additional windows here. So here's a plus button where you can dock additional stuff here. Also, when there's a floating window, so I could, for instance, rip off that create thing here and dock it somewhere else. So it's totally possible to dock it down here. As soon as there's a blue stripe, you can dock things there. So I would simply, to put it back in my place, would simply dock it over here, and there's my create window. So actually I did it wrong. Let me rip it off again. So actually I want to dock it here side by side with the Explorer. Down here there's a property editor. Whenever you click on something, you see the properties of the object, very much like attribute editor in Maya. So there's no big construction history, so there's no modifier stack or something. That works a little bit different here in Stingray. Down on the bottom of the screen, you see an asset browser and a log console. The console gives you error messages. You can filter it by error messages, warnings, and other messages. And in the asset browser, you can browse several folders. For example, here's my levels folder where I can load a different level. Some of these levels have icons. Materials and objects have icons, and you can, in many cases, you can preview everything in this asset preview window, at least move around it already and have a look at the thing. Okay, so that's the first overview of the window. We also have create pull-down menus and a window pull-down menu. Many of these functions here in the window pull-down menu are actually the things that you have seen here on this plus sign, these ones here. So many of these would do the same thing. Others are launching completely external apps like the Scaleform Studio, as I said, for the user interface. WYs for audio. It's a complete suite to edit and maintain an audio database and do certain things to your sounds in the game. And there's a navigation lab that is there to fine adjust the building of navigation meshes on your scene. We will have a look at that a little bit later. And there are other things down here, the bake light maps, for example. And we will also have a look at that in a few minutes. So let's start with this scene here. So what you currently see, and maybe I select the sofa for a second, just to frame my camera in on it, because that is the same like in Maya. You can hit the F key to frame on something. Different is the selection from Maya. The control is the toggling. When I hold control, I can toggle things together. Otherwise, things would be added to the selection. So if I want to unselect something, I simply hold control and toggle things off. You see that it's completely textured already. There's a normal map on the sofa, for example, where there's something going on with the camera. You see that there's there's some distortion with the camera. When I select something, you see that the actual shading is different from the wireframe here. The chrome ball that we see here is a so-called reflection probe. An object that holds the reflection in the scene, because we don't want to do real ray tracing on a graphics card, especially not in game. So this reflection probe creates some sort of a reflection map in the scene that allows us to make that so much faster. It's not a real reflection. You see, for example, this counter here is not reflected in the ground. We will have a look at that in a second. So to be able to do settings on the screen or with a display, we need to create something called a shading environment. A shading environment holds all the settings that you want to do with such a camera. And you see the whole display changes a little bit. It looks a little bit colder, and some things have changed. For example, we see some blooming here on the right side with this bright spot. And some other things also have changed. So let's go through the list here. So you see that the shading environment is now selected, and down here we see some settings for the shading environment. I can make this section a little bit larger so that we can see, on one side the list of things that I can manipulate. On the other side, the settings for these things. I can manipulate all the things together in one huge string of settings, or I could go and click on the individual pieces of the settings one by one and play with those. So for example, here I clicked on the global lighting, and there are things like the map that is the environment map here for the global lighting, the sky, the so-called sky dome. And there's an intensity setting, so I can simply grab the value and move it up and see what it's like when the sky is so much brighter. If I want to go back to my original settings, there's a shortcut like in 3ds Max. When you hit the right mouse button, it drops the value that you currently have and goes back to the original value where you came from. So that is one setting that you can go from here. Shadow mapping is good for these shadow maps, so it defines the resolution for the shadow maps and also the sharpness of these shadow maps, so you could change that from here. A fog, which is surprising, there's a fog defined in the scene that we can hardly see. So if I switch it on and off, you can actually not see anything. That comes from the distances here. So the distances are way too big. So when I set this down to 20, for example, you can easily see the fog. And of course, you could change the color of the fog and the intensity and everything of this thing. So we don't need the fog here. Initially it was set so far in the distance that it doesn't do anything. It would only slow us down. So we want to get rid of all these settings that we are not using. Exposure is something that you can play with, make it brighter or darker. And as I said, right mouse button on if you have changed something will bring you back to the original value. And by the way, it is right mouse button while you are holding the left mouse button. Screen space ambient occlusion makes shadows in little gaps. You know, wherever there's a geometry standing on top of each other, where there's a corner of geometry, you get the screen space ambient occlusion. And we also have these screen space reflections, which go a little bit closer towards the ray tracing. As I said, you know, some things are not visible in the reflections here. This column here, for example, is not visible. So as soon as I switch on screen space reflection, you suddenly see, oh yeah, that makes a difference. Now I see the column here at least a little bit darkish. This one is, you know, the bright spot is mirroring in the ground a little bit, and the counter is also more visible in the reflections here. So it makes the screen space reflection make a lot of sense because it, you know, takes some load off creating reflection maps. Depth of field is relatively easy. I'll switch it on and you see everything is blurred because the focal distance is too close to the camera. So I can play around with it. You see it's very jumpy because it makes huge steps. You can hold the control key when you move these values around, and holding the control key makes it much more soft. So you will have it easier to adjust the value. So when I just have some sharpness here in this area, you will see that it looks very much like a macro, like a very small model. That's a typical sign here. The depth of field is very strong in these cases. So for this scenery, it doesn't make much sense. Motion blur, interestingly, is on by default. It gives you a little bit better behavior when you move the camera around. Of course, it's also a performance thing because it has to draw multiple times. That's how motion blur is done here. And when you bump it up to 5, for example, you will certainly see a performance drop depending on the graphics card. Lens quality is an interesting thing. So let's switch it on. You won't see a difference because all the values are set to 0. So when we go with a distortion in one direction, this one here, this is a barrel distortion. And the question sometimes is, why should I want to do that? Because of course it gives me some, you know, psychedelic look into the scene as if it was a real wide angle here. It is actually these distortions here, the barrel distortion, and the other direction is called pincushion distortion. No, I think, yeah, this is the pincushion distortion. These two are actually artifacts from cheap lenses. So if you have an SLR, for example, or even on mobile phones, the cameras have these distortion things because they are relatively wide angle. And, you know, physically, it's very difficult to create an image that is flat and doesn't create these distortions, you know, these bent lines on the screen. So it is a little bit like lens flares in rendering, where we try to produce something that is actually a problem in the real world. Lens flares are reflections inside the optical elements of a lens, of a camera lens. So we try to create something that happens in the real world, which is a problem actually, but just to make it look more realistic. So of course this distortion is very strong, so we want to scale it down a little bit just so that it happens very slightly, but then it looks more realistic. And another thing is the fringing, the color fringing. Look at this one here. In the real world, you would see that is also a problem of the light bending on optical elements, on lenses inside the camera. It's something that camera builders try to avoid, or lens builders try to avoid, because it's not good. You know, on the side of the screen, it happens more than in the center of the screen. But if you try to make something super realistic, it may make sense to add a very little color fringing here, you know, the color distortion. So, okay, let's switch that off. We don't need it at the moment. Another thing is the blooming here that we see. That is what we see from the bright spot here. So, you know, threshold means when does it start? So from how bright does it have to be to start blooming? And then, you know, we can make it really strong and overdrive it. There's a fall of setting, etc., etc. And there's another interesting thing, which is lens dirt. When I set it to 1, you won't see much. You only see a white blooming because you have to have a map to do some lens dirt here. So I can pick this one here. This is ready made, and it's some lens dirt. Maybe I can make it stronger. It's some, you know, it simulates a dirty lens or dirty glasses. If you are wearing glasses, you would see that from time to time. You know, you have something on the glass and gives you this dirt in the screen. Makes sense if scene in your game is something with dirt, with water or so that splashes onto the player, then it makes sense to, you know, create something like this to simulate the look of a dirty camera or dirty visor or something like that. So switch it off again. This is blooming. And then a vignette is the darkening of the corners, also something that actually comes from cameras. So very cheap lenses do that a lot to darken the corners of your image. And some people start to like it. So it's actually a filter on Instagram, for example, that allows you to simulate a cheap camera or cheap lenses from 100 years ago. Which is kind of funny. Okay, so these are, or this was a short introduction into the, you know, camera capabilities of Stingray. So all of these things together with the shaders, we'll talk later about it, allow you to, you know, create a stunning visual experience for your players. All of these, of course, are also seen in the games view when you start to play your game. So let's load another scene and look at some of the other features of the rendering system. So here I have a scene that is actually, no, I don't want to save this one here. So here I have a scene that is a very simple one. So it's a little bit of architecture. So it's a little architectural scene. It's just this building here, and actually I can look around with my right mouse button. So you see it's a relatively boring scene with the building and some sunlight shining into it. We can see the sky here. So there's a sky up there, and it looks a little bit like the sun was shining in here, but it's actually only this light. So this light, when I move it around with my rotation, you see that, okay, that is the sunlight that we see here. Okay, I'll leave it where it was because we want to simulate something with this light. So actually what happens in reality when you have such a light would be that, you know, the light bounces in here and you know, because of the illuminated ground here, this hallway would also be illuminated from the ground here because the sunlight is extremely bright and bounces light, you know, into this shadow region. And on the other side of the building, in this aisle here, we will see less light because it's you know, there's not so much light bouncing in, but also there's light bouncing in. Oops, excuse me. So. And also we need to see shadows in the building and all of that stuff that's currently not happening. And we are so much, you know, we so much get used to this look here that many people don't actually see a big difference. So the reality looks so much different. And we do that whole lighting simulation here with the dialog bake light maps. Actually, I didn't want to dock it in here. I just want to have it in a floating window. So this bake light maps dialog allows me now to with certain quality settings here, to bake the lighting situation and simulate the real lighting situation where light bounces off of objects and, you know, picks up the color of an object and lights illuminate something else. We can do that in a live baking session here. It would take, with these settings, the settings are very low. With these settings, it would take me around a minute. So what I'm going to do here is to start a live baking session, to start a live baking session where the system starts to interactively add in the samples that it has finished already. And that is pretty cool because it allows you to start watching how the light simulation goes. And currently with all the recording and transmissions going on, it's pretty slow, so it takes a while. You see, the first thing that happens is that the color is changing dramatically. It's much warmer now, the color is much warmer coming from the sun than this color texture that is applied to the object. The object has a very cold, whitish color texture, and the light that is bouncing against it is very warm. And we see on the left side already it becomes very darkish here, and I wish it would update a little bit more. Yeah, it doesn't make much sense together with the transmission that we have here, so I'll stop it and it removes all the lighting, and then I'm going to load another scene that I have prepared here under levels. I have this one here that's done. So look at the camera window here. You will see how the end product looks like. This is the end product. So after a minute or so, this was done with the very lowest settings. After a minute or so, you would see this. So we have a much warmer look of the whole color. Here in the one aisle, we see that light bounces off of the ground and illuminates the ceiling in the aisle, which is surprising. And here on the other side of the building, you see that it's much darker because there's not so much light bouncing in. And if you set the quality higher, you will see that it's much more balancing between left and right because there are more light bounces, more rays that are being followed to create this extra light mapping. So it doesn't modify the texture maps and the normal maps on top of on the geometry. It just adds the lighting to the object. Okay, so that is the light baking in Stingray. So let's go to the next example here, and that is about navigation. I'm going to load a navigation scene. So, and in this scene, you see an amazing number of objects and, layers of geometry on my object. So this is the whole level here. We have a whole bunch of players here. These small guys here in the middle are automatic players. So they are driven by the engine. They are bots. They walk around or sneak around and do their thing automatically, whatever it is they could have the task to aim at my player. My player sits here where the yellow round the drop thing is. So that's the start. When I launch the game, that's the start where I start to see my player. And there are other elements in the scene. The blue mesh here, that is the navigation mesh. That tells the bots where they're allowed to go. So for example, they can walk up these stairs here on the right side. And to be able to walk up the stairs, you have these objects here which are connectors. So they connect a lower level to the next level so that my bots would be able to jump up these stairs. We will see that in a bit. The settings for these objects are done with these two configuration objects. So here's a bot configuration object that contains all of the settings or most of the settings for the bots. And right beside it, there is a navigation world object that carries the settings for the nav mesh. Because the nav mesh is created completely automatic. I don't want to build all of that manually and then all the changes I need to start the model again and modify everything. I want it to work automatically. Another advantage of this automatic, of course, saves you a lot of time, but another advantage is the fact that it can work with dynamic objects Very nice. So look at this black cube here. In the game, I will be able to shoot at this cube, and then the cube will move. So when I shoot at it, it moves a little bit to the side, which also means, when I want the bots to avoid the black cube, we need to cut out a hole into the nav mesh automatically. And when the cube moves a little bit, you need to cut it out again. So it needs to be alive. This mesh needs to be alive, and interactively we want to have it re-render and recalculate that mesh. Another thing are these slopes here. It is possible for the bots to walk up and down these slopes. But for that, I need to have a setting, and I can do that within a Stingray already with this navigation window here. I can set the slope maximum angle with this value here. So from 45, I change it to 20, and now look at the slopes when I click on Generate Nav Mesh. You see it's pretty quick, within a second or half a second, it recalculates that nav mesh and removes the slopes from being walkable for the bots. So I'm going to change that back, otherwise we lock in some of the bots in their location. So, but the navigation, or the settings that I can do with it, Stingray, are not a lot. So what I try to do now is to start the player. You will see me, or you see the player appear up here where the green arrow is. So I'm going to click on play. And then I'll go back into Stingray and launch the navigation lab. The navigation lab is a whole interactive application that allows me, and I want to put it on the left side of the screen and the player here on the other side, that allows me to play around with my data and interactively change the behavior. So here on the right side, you see my viewer's camera, my game camera, and my player is walking in front of me. And then I can move over into the navigation lab. And here in the navigation lab, I can connect to my game. So with this dialog here, I'm able to connect to my game. So it transfers all the geometry. So now we see the complete level here. It transfers all the geometry over to my navigation lab, and I can change settings, and then it would do the opposite direction. And here you see the yellow columns. These are the bots walking around. There's one orange column over here that is my player. So I could start walking around here in my game. I'm going to hit W, so I'm moving forward. So this is now my player, and I'm moving around. Okay, so let's go over into this one here and see if I can go a little bit closer. So here you see me now. Here you see the orange column in my, and by the way, I can also go and have a game perspective in my navigation lab. So, but at the moment, I just want to fly above the scene, and I want to actually look from the side here. So this is actually a very good view that we have now. So now when I go over into my game, you see me aiming around. Now when I shoot at this black box on the left side, you see in the navigation lab, the black box is a red wireframe, but when I shoot at it, it becomes an orange wireframe. It becomes interactive while the navigation lab cuts out a new piece of the navigation geometry of the navigation mesh to allow it to recalculate for the bots so that they avoid the black cube in my game. And that's a very cool capability to be able to on the fly, recalculate your navigation mesh and to change all the settings of this thing. So let's leave the game. So that was the first look into the game player that we have. I hope So I'm trying to have a look at what you receive here. Seems to be relatively slow, the the transmission. Okay. It is not completely interactive because it's a webinar, but we are recording it so that you can later watch it on YouTube again to see more of the interactive stuff here. So I don't want to be too slow with my operations, would be a little bit boring. So from navigation, we go over to model creation and also shader creation, and a very important part of the whole workflow, because normally you know when you work with another games engine, it is so that you model things in Maya, may even apply shaders and of course UVs, but then you have to redo all the shaders because they are not comparable. The game engine shaders are normally not comparable with what you have in our 3D applications. So here in the scenery, we have this robot which has applied some motion, some idle motion, is aiming at something with a gun, obviously, and we want to modify that robot while it is in our scene. So I can click on the robot, and when I right mouse button on the robot, you see that I can do certain things. So open it in the unit editor. The unit editor is some sort of an object editor which allows it to attach scripts to the object, to attach collision objects and stuff like that. I can find it in the asset browser. The asset browser is the one down here, and it can open the folder where this object sits and highlight the object. So once it is highlighted, I can see it in my asset preview, of course. You see there should be a gun actually, and I can also right mouse button on it, and you see here I can send this now to Maya or 3ds Max, or re-import it, for example, or show in Explorer, in the Windows Explorer, where that object is. So let's try and send it over to Maya. And you see now Maya is flashing orange down here on my screen, because Maya is saying, hey, somebody wants to capture my internet connection and wants to feed in some objects. Shall we allow that? Yes, of course. In this case, it is allowed, and we don't do, or it's actually only a security thing so that no viruses, for example, can install on your computer and ruin your objects. You can also always disallow this connection. So now it's loading. I'm going to dock Maya on the left side, on the right side of the screen, and Stingray on the left side. So here on the right, or maybe I do it the other way around. So this way. So here on the left side of the screen, you see Maya. I can, of course, select the object, zoom my camera into it, and it has the skeleton inside. I can modify the skeleton, of course, with all the bindings, but it is of course not animated. Only in Stingray, when I play around with Stingray, you would see this animation. So what we have here now is some shading in Maya, and you see that the camera looks, or the appearance looks slightly different. One thing, of course, is the motion blur that is always applied to the camera in Stingray. There's a little bit of blooming going on. You see the very bright spots down here are showing some blooming, and that also applies to the shader. But in general, I see a little bit more contrast here on the right side than in Maya. The Maya shader is not bad. It looks not so bad, but it's not as contrasty as in Stingray. And that is because we have this sRGB gamma color profile switched on in Maya. And for Stingray, there's a different tone map, a different color profile available in Maya, so that when I switch that on, you should see a difference in the contrast. It's much more contrast. It's more colorful. The bluish colors here are stronger now and more match the appearance on the right side of the screen. So that is something that you should be aware of, the color correction in the different applications. So there's one thing. Second, I was talking about the shaders. So let's go select this object and go to the material attributes. And you will see in the attribute editor, this is a shader effects object. So shader effects is available to open, and when I open that window, the shader effects window, which is a node editor, which allows me to change the whole network of the shader. This is the network over here. So now let's have a look how what the shader is like in Stingray, and that is a really surprising thing. First of all, Stingray is using a shader that is shared between several objects. So it is a parent material, and I can, if I want to modify it and open the graph of it, I need to make it unique. So let's do that, make it unique, and then I can open the shader graph. And you see in here, it is exactly the same shader graph in Stingray than it is in Maya. So it's the same thing. They are 100% compatible. You can move them back and forth. You can edit them in either program, and they are completely compatible. And the same for 3ds Max, of course. So that allows you to define your shaders while you are modeling, while you are building things together, and modify the shaders, and they will be compatible in Stingray so that you don't have to rebuild the whole shading process. And one third thing that is very impressive here is the fact that I can now edit my object because Maya is now connected to Stingray. Look down here in the right side, lower corner of the window. You will see a green connected to Stingray and an update button. So when I do something with my object, so for example, I'm selecting a bunch of vertices up here and switch on soft selection, and I would scale them to make them a really big head, right? So, and then I click on update. It asks me, do you really want to override that file? Then I say yes, and wait a second, and you see already it does something here. It starts to reload the object in Stingray, and after reloading it, you see the same modification in Stingray already. So this direct connection between the two applications is very helpful because it saves you a lot of searching for save locations and stuff like that. It does it automatically. So when it sends the robot to Maya, Maya knows automatically where that object sits, where all the shaders sit, and then when it writes it back, it overwrites exactly that file so that Stingray automatically knows which object to load. Okay, good. So let's go back to Stingray and load another scene here. And that is a very interesting one because here we see the actual creation of the game itself. Let me check, are there any questions so far? No. So in this scenery here, I now want to play around with the actual game's level. So what you see here is a level with a city with a lot of depth of field, so it's very blurry in the background, and that is there to make it look tiny. It is as if you have a very tiny street or a very tiny town, and you would drive through that tiny little model town here. And the game is so that you have a taxi and you are supposed to pick up these bright coins that are placed on the street here, and also these passengers that are placed on the street. So this is one of the passengers. The passengers are supposed to whistle and wave and say, hello here, come on, pick me up, and then you should pick him up and not run over him. So we can play part of that game already. Let me switch on my my games controller. We can play parts of the game already. It's controlled with a gamepad, but most of the logic is not working yet. So the coins are not doing anything. The passengers are not doing anything. So let me first check the game itself. I don't know how much you can see of it. It's impossible to control. So wait a second. Unfortunately, when this window is open, it doesn't allow me to grab the title bar of that thing. So maybe you can see it like that. So it asks me to press start, and then the little taxi starts driving. Okay, there's a countdown, 3, 2, 1. So I can drive with the taxi and, you know, do some of the things. And it fails when the oxygen of the taxi is used up. So the taxi has some sort of oxygen there. So, and I think I left some of the logic in there. So let me maybe let me remove these things that are not supposed to be there. So okay, so I just removed some of the logic that was there already. So I'm going to pick the coin here and open it in the unit editor. So this is the unit editor that I was talking about earlier. The coin is actually just a box, a little bit scaled, and it is supposed to do some things for us. So first of all, I wanted to have a certain an animation. I want to animate it and spin around and maybe, you know, bump up and down a little bit. So this animation can be defined in Stingray already. There's an animation editor there. And then the second thing I want to do is to have a collision object. So around the coin, we have a box that is the collision object, which means it is, you know, near enough for a collision. When the taxi gets close enough to collect this coin here, it doesn't need to pick it physically, you know, to pick the center geometry. So a collision box around this coin will be good enough. The whole logic is created in this tab here in the unit flow. The unit flow is the script for this object. So let's go right mouse button on this collision object here and create a physics trigger node. This is the node, this is the function that gets executed as soon as something touches that collision object around the coin. And something else, I can start an event by saying, okay, as soon as this thing is loaded, I want to start the animation. That's very important because you know, when the object is loaded, I want it to automatically start the animation. So I would say I'm going to create a function called unit spawn. So this one here, the physics trigger, will execute when there's a collision, and this one will execute as soon as the object is loaded or appears in the scene, which is not exactly the same as when the game starts. You know, it could appear later. So when the unit is spawned, I want to play some animation. So animation is up here. I want to reset and play an animation clip, and I have to select an animation clip. There's only 2 animation clips here in my whole scene. There's one for the coin and one for another object. So let's take this one. So that is the animation clip, and here's the trigger. So when the unit is spawned, I want to play the animation. It's going to loop, it's going to have a speed of 1, and it's going to play for this unit. Me means the unit where we're in. So it's not another unit. You can play animations for other units, of course, but this one means the unit that we are actually working from. So this part is done. The animation clip works. As soon as the unit is spawned, the animation clip will work. And then the physics trigger here, what shall we do with the physics trigger? As soon as something collides with the object, I want to play a sound. Here in the audio, we find WWise. WWise is a suite for an audio database, a complete database that allows you to create sets of audio clips and then trigger them from within these unit flows or these flow graphs. So as soon as something collides with my coin, I want to, you know, play the sound event. And the name of the sound event, oh, So it asked me for a name, but I have no clue. So where is my sound event? So let's dive into WWise for a moment. So here's WWise audio. As I said, it's a complete suite. It's not easy to just set up a sound in a few minutes. So here are some music clips that would play within the game. So maybe, I don't know if you can hear that. So you see that is the overall music theme in the game. There's when a person calls for a cab, they would whistle. You know, that is the sound. And you see there are different ones. There are at least 3 different ones. So it plays a random of a number of sounds. And the one that we are looking for here for the coin, when the coin gets picked up, is this one. Pling. It's just a single pling. So the name of it is SFX UI _ coin. So we're going to take that. I don't want to dive too deep into it because it's first of all, it's a very complex application. It allows you to do anything with sounds in games. So it would take way too long, and I don't know it too well enough to show you all the aspects of it. So the name of the thing is SFX _ UI _ coin. That's what we need to enter here. Okay, so this is played, and when that happens after the collision, I want the unit or the coin to disappear. This particular unit should disappear. So I want to unspawn the unit. This is this event here. Unspawn the unit. So trigger that when the audio is finished. So it may unspawn or hide this unit. And I want to have another thing to happen when the taxi eats that coin. I want to reset its oxygen level. And that is something I can do on with an event like this one here, unit flow event. I want to start a certain function. It's a function called reset timer, which is in this case a very generic name. Of course, you should have better names for your functions so that they don't clash with some other thing. But in this case, reset timer will reset the timer of the taxi. So it is launched when the coin disappears, but you know the unit is still the coin. The unit says it's me. And when I click on it, there's no list of units in my scene. It simply says you can clear it or take this unit. So where does the unit come from? How do I set the unit? It's this one here. At the physics trigger, there's a touching unit. Whoever touches that coin will get a reset trigger event afterwards. So it's not so hard to understand. It's like programming. You write code. You either write code or you do it interactively here in such a flow graph. So let's leave this unit editor, save this thing so the coin is doing its thing. That is fine. So let's go to the passenger and do the same thing with the passenger. Open it in the unit editor, and then we look in the flow graph. The flow graph is completely empty. So we have a bunch of collision objects around the actual body of this passenger. The flow graph is completely empty. So what are we supposed to do? When a taxi gets close to this object, that's the first collision, the outer collision object. When the taxi gets close, I want this thing to hail for a taxi. Hello, taxi, whistle, and make some signs to say I want to be picked up. When it gets closer, there's the actual possibility for the taxi to pick him up, and then the taxi could also run over the body of the passenger and kill him. There are certain possibilities, and all of these possibilities need to be handled here in the flow graph, and that takes too long to do it interactively. So I have prepared something, and that's actually funny here. I've prepared something, and that is a script. Look at this one here. It's a JSON script with all of the connections of the nodes that are necessary to make this passenger do what I want him to do. It's a lot of nodes, so I simply hit Control A to select everything, Control C, and then I go into the unit editor and hit Control V to paste. And then I get this. Oh, wow. That should be a wow event when you see that. You can, these two things are comparable. You can either have a flow graph or you can have a script. The script was created by, taking all of the connections here, Control A of the flow graph, and paste it into a text editor. And then you can paste it back into the flow graph of another scene, for example, or on another workstation. If you want to give your colleague the logic that you just created, simply use copy and paste between different windows on your screen. So that's a very easy and surprising thing that it works like that. So we can close this passenger thing already. That is done. So and then I will make a final play with this character. So let's see how or if I can pick up this coin here and do what I need to do. So I hope you see a little bit of that when I press play. So I can pick that up. So you see I picked up the passenger. So I picked up the next passenger, and each time I do that, you see the yellow bar on top of that taxi cab, and see it, reset the oxygen of the taxi. So all of the logic that we created so far works fine. It's so easy to go in and test it, and then leave the thing and open the unit editor again to play around with the flow. And of course, there's also a level flow. There's a lot of logic behind in the level already that does all these things, like playing audio and stuff like that. Okay, so that was a short introduction into Stingray. Actually a very, very quick view at it. I want to jump back into Maya and show you some more things that are very nice to do in Maya. So you've seen already the interaction between Stingray and Maya. So the possibility to say, I'm gonna load an object or I'm going to push an object directly from Stingray into Maya. That was the thing with the robot here. And now we are going to look at some of the possibilities in Maya to handle your objects and to play around with them. So one of the important things, and let me leave Stingray here. One of the important things that I try to tell my customers when we look at the workflow of creating objects and creating UVs, animations, etc. A very important aspect of that for me is the handling, the workflow of the whole thing. I know and I see that many users don't care about it, and they don't worry too much about it. Oops, now I have a problem with this program here with my keyboard. Okay, so then we have to do it like this. So let me load this model here and show you what I mean with the workflow, with the actual workflow. So the viewport is processing a little bit longer. So this is a larger scene with large textures here. So let's talk about modeling. When I watch people model something, so I'm visiting my customers in their office, and they show me problems, for example, they have with the software. I see modelers always have a screen like this. Well, it's Maya, you would say. There's nothing wrong with it, but for me, there's something wrong with it because there's a lot of decoration around on the screen. For a beginner, it would be fine. For an experienced modeler, the screen contains a lot of stuff that is not necessary here. We absolutely don't need so many things here on the screen. So for example, when you model, you don't need the timeline and the playback range. So it would be easy to go on the display, and in UI elements you can switch off the time slider and the range slider. But of course, you see, sub-menus are always a problem when you have to open a menu, then dive into the sub-menu and maybe another sub-menu. It takes a lot of time, and you don't want to do it all the time. You don't want to toggle back and forth between these windows. So one solution here would be to rip off this window and leave it on the screen somehow, so that you can switch off the range slider and the command line just from the static window. A static window still, hides some things on the screen, so that's also no good solution. A very nice solution is this one here. When I hold my space bar, I get this. Actually, normally you would see something like this. This is the hotbox in Maya. The hotbox allows you to access all pull-down menus. So these lines here, these bars, are pull-down menus, the same that you switch on here on top of the screen. So these pull-down menus allow you to access all mesh functions, for example, or all of the functions. What did we have here? The display menu, for example, is the same as in the pull-down menus on top of the screen. Another thing that this one allows you here is to access marking menus around the hotbox. So in each direction, north, east, south, and west, there is a marking menu. So here in the north, there's a marking menu for different for different panel configurations. Here on the right side in the east, there's a configuration, or there's a marking menu to switch on and off the time slider and the playback range, for example. So all these parts of the user interface are available here, and it's really fast to access these marking menus. Down here you can change the content of the current panel, and here on the right side I've modified it for myself. I made myself a window marking menu that allows me to quickly open windows like the file path editor that I need all the time, or sometimes the script editor, or the new hotkey editor. So these marking menus are customizable, they are easy to access, and it's a very fast and easy way to change things within Maya. So you could start and switch off some of the user interface. So I'm holding Control and hit the space bar now. So with Control and space bar, you can make your screen a complete full screen. Most of the things are gone here, and you see that my pull-down menus are still there, and my panel menus are still there. So the pull-down menu and the icons are panel-related menus, and I can do a Shift M, Control M, and Shift Control M to hide these also. And now I have a complete full screen of Maya, and I can now still edit my object using the spacebar. So I'm holding the spacebar and I get my hotbox. And I can configure my hotbox so that I, for instance, only see the modeling pull-down menus. So here, mesh, edit mesh, etc. That's one thing. And I can also use other functions to access or other ways to access functions for my modeling process. So for example, I want to work on this top section of this satellite here. I've selected it already. I'm hitting F for frame selected, and it zooms in and shows me that object close up. Problem is that all the other objects in my scene are still there. So the textured background, the whole planet here, I don't need all that stuff. I just want to work on this selected object. So I'm going to hold Control 1 or hit Control 1 as a new hotkey to isolate just the selected thing. So in the panel related menus, you will find this in the show. So here's isolate select, and it's a good idea to switch this one off here, the auto load new objects, because otherwise it's going to freak out when I do an extrude, for example, or cut things. It would always reload the new objects or try to reload the new objects. So I can now play around with this object here. So what we have here are actually two separate polygon shells. So the inner part here is a separate polygon shell. I can select faces in Maya by right mouse button and access this marking menu on any object. Just right mouse button and you have a choice to select faces, edges, vertices, UVs, either UVs or whole UV shells. So you can all go back to the object mode. So I make the choice for faces at the moment. And you see when I hover over the object, it highlights what is supposed to be picked in red. That is the pre-selection highlight, which is a pretty strong thing because it allows me to visualize some things that going to happen. So at the moment when I click on one of these faces here, just that one gets selected. There's a new function with a double click that makes the double click or gives the double click a sense in all of these selection things, selection situations. So in this case, it's going to select the whole polygon shell, which is only the inner part here. And I can hit the W and move this object around. So, and you see the trouble with moving this object is that my manipulator is somehow, well, my manipulator is just in the world coordinates and not in the local coordinates of the system. So let's undo that thing here and change the setting of the manipulator. There is, when you hold Shift Control right mouse button, there is the choice of the object coordinate system. So we change it to object, but unfortunately the object coordinate system is also baked to the world coordinate system, so there's no change here. So we can stay in the world coordinate system. So how do I change my manipulator to move this object along its own axis? That is done with the so-called pivot mode. When I hold the D key, you see that I'm in pivot mode now. I can grab the pivot, and when I release the D key, it jumps back to be the move tool. So the pivot is the rotation point, the scaling center, and also for the move manipulator, it's the direction of the movement. So it's a local direction of the movement. So what we can do now here is to say, instead of holding the D key all the time, I'm going to just hit the D key shortly and then it stays in that mode. And that's another improvement over this method, that I can simply stay there. So my cursor tells me what I can do. When I click somewhere in the empty space, it's going to reset the pivot. So when I move it somewhere and I don't want to have that, I can reset the pivot. Of course, I also have undo. When I hover over the geometry, you see that the cursor changes to say align. Now it wants to align that pivot to something, to a face, for example. Let's align it to this face here. And wow, you see that not only does the pivot move there, it also the axis, the local axis, align to that facet. So we could go and say align it to this center point here, so that my x-axis points along or points in that direction where I want to move that object. The other, unfortunately, for a point, you just have the point normal. The other two axes, like the y and the z axis, point somewhere. It's kind of random because every solution, where the x-axis points in the correct direction is good. I can do another thing by, holding the control key. I can just orient that pivot, meaning I want to rotate it so that one axis points along this edge here, and the other axis points in the direction of the normal. So when I do this one here, holding control key, click on this one, you see that still the x-axis points in the correct direction, but also the y and the z-axis make much more sense now. So that is very cool. Also, when you right mouse button, when you're in pivot mode, you see these options that you can pin the component pivot and snap just the orientation or just the position. So you can separate that. You can reset the position, orientation, or everything. So, and also exit the pivot mode. So now I've left the pivot mode. I could also hit the D key, and now I can grab this this extra object here and move it in that direction. You see that the pivot now snaps back because I said to pin that pivot, right? So let's undo the whole operation of moving that thing out. Go into the pivot mode and right mouse button, and if I release the pin component pivot, it would reset itself, of course, and then stay with the object. That is something I don't want, so I'm going to make this thing again here, orient my pivot, and then I would switch on pin component pivot, because in my example here it makes more sense. So I want to move this out. I don't care for the pivot to switch back, and then I want to select the border of this object. Well, that's easy. I can do this, select one of the border faces and shift double click on the next one. That would already select the whole border. I could also do something and display my modeling toolkit. So here on the right side, I don't know why it's not appearing. So here we go. So here in my modeling toolkit, I now have the possibility to switch on so-called selection constraints. A selection constraint is something where you say, I just want to select certain things. So for example, on the border. So whatever I select, points, edges or faces, it will only select points on the border. So when I hover over it, it appears in red to do some pre-selection highlighting. That's also an indication for it what you have switched on. In this case, the selection constraints. And then when I click on it, it gets selected. And now I can grab my pivot and move this thing down and scale it, etc., etc. So, and the pivot, of course, snaps back because I've set I told it to do so, right? So here's something. So there are other selection constraints. There's an angle selection constraint, for example, which is interesting. It asks me for a value. So let's give it 35 degrees for an angle and see what happens. So when I hover over the geometry, you see that parts of the geometry will be highlighted in red. All these faces are within an angle of 35 degrees to each other. So that would be the selection. Or I can select the top part here of my object with a single click, because that is within 35 degrees of the selection. So also I could, do a grow selection coming from here. When I switch this off here, I could grow the selection. It doesn't want me to do it. Yes, of course. Excuse me. So it was the wrong hotkey. So I grow the selection coming from here, select the whole cap of the thing, for example, or maybe grow one more and select the whole thing and maybe scale this down a little bit, make it smaller and stuff like that. So all of that is possible with a single click. Right, with these selection constraints. There's something for the Softimage users here. Instead of saying, I want to have angle on, and then I want to have to switch it off again, I want to switch it on again, you can simply middle mouse button on it. So that would switch on the arrow, that would switch it off, and when you middle mouse button, it would switch the same thing on again. So that allows you to toggle things on and off, very much like in the pull-down menus. The same thing is now allowed within these ones here. So next thing that I want to do is to select edge loops. So I'm going to go and switch to edge selection. Now I want to change these edge loops. So when I do something with this edge loop, and in this example here, yeah, I can leave the component selection pinned. In this example here, when I move this object around, you see that everything works, but it changes the shape of the whole thing. I don't want it to change shapes here. So when I move this one around, for example, I don't want to have a shape like this. I actually want these edges to slide along the region or the surface of the object. And that is possible here with a transform constraint. There's an edge slide that allows me to say, I now move these downwards, and you see that they stay on the original shape of the object. So they only slide along the neighboring edges. And I'll undo that because I want to switch on another feature in the settings for the current tool. So Shift Control right mouse button, there is a preserve UVs. So now when I slide this edge over the surface, you will see, that the UVs will be preserved. And that is very cool because I can change the topology of the whole surface and the UVs remain the same. So now I'm going to click on this one here, and I want to not only move it downwards, I want to actually move it sideways also. So I can move it, slide it over here, and you see what happens here. It moves the whole thing across the surface, on the surface. So we will switch off the edge loop thing, but we leave the transform constraint for edges on because now I want to move some of the vertices here on the side. So this one here, and now I need to switch off my pin component. So when I move this point here, you see my cursor changes to slide, or tells me it's sliding. So I can only move this vertex on the neighboring edges, and I cannot move it somewhere else. So that is good already, but I need it for the other side as well. So I want to mirror the whole thing, and we can switch on a symmetry function up here. So for the topology, I can tell it, this is my symmetry axis from now on. So when I pick that vertex, it's also going to pick the same vertex on the other side. So let's watch it from here. So now it's doing the same thing on the other side. So that is a very good trick. There's another one where you can say, instead of clicking on the object and then clicking again to grab the manipulator, I can do an easy trick and switch on the so-called tweak mode. Excuse me. The tweak mode is up here in the modeling toolkit settings. You can also engage it by holding the high comma, which is on the American keyboard. It's between the escape key and the tab key. So I don't have an American keyboard here, so I'm using this button here. So now I can grab these points and just move them directly with a single click. I don't have to wait for the manipulator to show up. I can just do it so interactively. And that is especially when you want to modify many points, that is a huge help and saves you a lot of time. So we are still in the mirroring mode, in the symmetry mode, and now let's grab some of these edges here in the back and actually target weld them together. This target weld function lets me grab either in multi-selection. Wait a second. In multi-selection, it lets me grab either edges or points and weld them together. So for example, I grab these edges here, and you see, because it's mirroring, the mirroring is on, it snaps them together. Or I can grab these points and bang, snap, and drag them on top of each other, on top of the other one, which leaves me with this shape here. And this shape, I made this shape on purpose. So let's leave the tool and go select some faces. Actually select the whole row of faces. It stops to select faces where it finds a triangle, because triangles no longer have a face path feature. There's no direction for these triangles. Now what I want to do here with these is to extrude these faces a little bit, very tiny little bit. So I'm going to use the thickness to move it in, and maybe the offset to make it a little bit smaller. Right, so that is the shape that I wanted to achieve. So I leave the selection here because I also want, with this selection, create a new blend shader for these selected faces here, and I'm going to make them a little bit bluish to create some sort of a window shape here. So that is the stuff that I want to create. Okay, so let's go back into object mode and say we are finished with this. I'll hit Control 1 for the whole satellite to come back. Maybe switch off the lighting here, which creates some weird results. And then I can still take this object so I can still take this object and move it around. So when I hold my D key again, I can reset the manipulator, and probably it doesn't work because preserve UVs is on, the tweak mode is on. We don't need all of that. So here I've set my pivot. Now I can move this whole thing out a little bit so that it works again. So I've created some sort of a window for this object. When I hit 3, you can see the smoothed version of it. And you see, I've done all of that without any static pull-down menus. I've switched off the pull-down menus. I've switched off most of the user interface. Modeling toolkit is all that you need for modeling. So there's no need to create more user interface than you actually want on the screen. And it gives you a lot more space and a lot more freedom, especially with a large monitor. It's enjoyable to work on such a 3D only environment and just do all the things that you want to do with the marking menus right where you are, and you don't have to travel across the screen all the time.